It is Monday, September 29th, 2014. We're continuing our actual video series regarding interviewing with Mr. R. Karapetian, the one and only, and we all love him. And we're diving into a little bit more of the subject matter, at least not necessarily the years when you had children, because that's still going on, but the first year, the early years. I guess, so where were you when you first started, actually, I guess, you were in Minneapolis first when Pete came around?
The first four children were born in Minneapolis: Peter, Vicky, Paul, David.
Okay.
Martha was born while we were in Chattanooga, Tennessee, Lookout Mountain, Tennessee.
Okay.
Yeah.
I didn't realize you guys were there that long. So what were the approximate dates? Like 19...
In in Minneapolis?
Yeah.
We were in Minneapolis. We were married in 1953, and we were there from 1953 until 1959.
Okay.
And we moved to Lookout Mountain to work in Chattanooga. In 1959, we were there for 4 years. 1963.
Huh.
And 1963, we moved to Dallas.
Okay.
And so the years of raising family, which is really, I think, what we're dealing with, were started in Minneapolis, continued very young children in Lookout Mountain, and then really got into the teenage and the growing up years, shall we call them, in Dallas.
Understood.
The difficult years for some people, but they were wonderful years. They really were.
Good to know. Did you always know that you wanted kids?
You know, I assumed always that I would have children.
Okay.
I assumed that that was the, let's call it, the consequence of getting married. And I knew that I would be getting married. I knew that somewhere along the line I'd find a woman that I just had to live with for the rest of my life. And I lived with her for the rest of her life, 56 years. And that we met at the University of Minnesota.
Mm-hmm.
We met on the door, on a door that we both served as ushers at the symphony concerts in Minneapolis.
Oh, okay. So you began the courtship from
1953.
Okay.
Early 1953. Married in August, the end of August 1953. Peter was born in June 1954. 9 months, 6 days after we were married.
What was your reaction when you found out that Cherry was pregnant, or that you had your first kid on the way?
My reaction, as I remember it, was, well, okay, this is happening sooner than we thought it would, or that I certainly thought it would, a lot sooner, because we both your grandmother and I, had the idea that we would finish graduate work. We were already, she was just finishing her college work, undergraduate degree, and I was just returning to mine after having 3.5 years in the service in the U.S. Army. And I just figured that we'd finish our degree work, and I'd do my graduate work, and probably Sherry would do some graduate work, and then we would have a family. But it didn't work out that way. Those are the days before the simplicity and ease of having birth control that exists now. It was a little bit more complicated to have birth control in those years, and
Yeah.
here we are.
I can understand that. I guess kind of the process change was. Did you really have like a real sudden oh wow reaction when any of the other kids like just genuinely being surprised? Did you, or better put, did you expect to have as many kids as you did by the end of it?
Your grandmother put it once, I would love to have 6 children. She said that actually before Peter was born, your father. But medical issues arose in the process of carrying children, she was told she better not. And it was not exactly what we thought would be wise, even having 4 or 5, but life goes on. And we had 5, and we were very fortunate.
All of them are actually pretty healthy, which is
Exactly, they're healthy, and your grandmother really, although she had some medical issues much of her life, she really was very fortunate to be able to move onward with medically well. She was doing well also in her life.
And since you did spend so much time in Minneapolis, I guess starting a family, how did you feel about it as a point to raise to have and raise children? And at least, like, did you feel it was a good city and a good area for kids to grow up in?
The Twin Cities, Minnesota, Twin Cities in Minnesota are really one of the best places in this country. Really, the culture is good. The attitudes, the politics, even at that time, certainly, it was much more democratic. It has turned Republican in recent years, but it was very democratic in terms of the party politics. But Minnesota was always considered a progressive state. And it was a good place, good education. We were right in the middle of the educational milieu because we were both associated with, early on, with the University of Minnesota. She was doing scientific research. When she was working, she was doing scientific research after her degree on the university campus. And I was doing broadcast work at the university's radio station while finishing my degree.
Yeah. So you were pretty stretched thin in terms of time, it sounds like.
Yeah. It's interesting to try and finish a degree on any kind of a full-time basis and also do a part-time church music program, and then also earn enough living. In addition to that, I had a certain amount of Veterans Administration assistance at that time. But then it was hard to earn enough of a living to keep body and soul together easily. But we survived, and we really, in many respects, thrived.
Yeah.
It was a good city. It was a very good city to get started in.
Right.
And there were many years, especially Chattanooga was a difficult place to be in many respects, professionally for me certainly. It was certainly a totally different culture, and particularly at that time. But the Twin Cities were a good place to raise family.
So, so in general, I guess just touching back, you enjoyed the city, you didn't enjoy. Is there any place, I guess, that you regret moving for the sake of your kids, other than, I guess, Lookout Mountain? Because you're talking in a way, at least to my mind, that says I wish we hadn't moved to Lookout Mountain just because it was a difficult time for you career-wise, and it was a difficult time for the kids. I don't know. Would you say that was probably one of your hardest points in being a dad?
I think that's correct. It was a very frustrating time for me, and any time a father has a personally frustrating time in his life, some of it carries over into raising his family. And so there's just no way to avoid that. I think if there was, we don't have choices about what's already happened in our lives, but if one could go back and say, if I could do something over again, I would certainly not go to Chattanooga again. I went there to be the business manager of the Chattanooga Symphony Orchestra, and I was there for 6 months before I made enough of a mistake to be fired by the board of directors. And it's easy enough in a new profession when you're doing something you've never done before to get in that kind of a situation. And the next 3.5 years were really, for me, professionally very, very difficult because there was very, very little to do in Chattanooga that I could earn enough of a living. And we essentially bailed out when we moved from Chattanooga in Tennessee to Dallas. We literally were starting life all over again as a family.
I guess how did that weigh on your conscience? I guess just having to essentially bail out, and how did that weigh on you, like feelings wise as a provider and as a father? How did you feel that impacted you?
It was very stressful. It was probably even more stressful than I realized at the time. But it was stressful enough that I was aware of. I had to find a job in a radio station for a little while. I had to find a job in an advertising agency for a little while, helping to produce some television film work. I had to work in the sales business of selling early copy machines in the days where you went literally put them in the back of your station wagon and took them out in the countryside and peddled them to law offices and corporate offices the best you could. And it was kind of frustrating. And those were the days before I realized that the music part of my life is really what I'm all about, and I need to really get on with focusing in that corner of my life. It was just survival, I think, is the best way to put it for me when we were in Chattanooga.
Did you ever have a fear that you weren't up to the challenge?
No. I'm the kind of a guy that always knows that somehow we'll muddle through, and and we did, but barely. I mean, barely. We really just barely did. But it was good that we were able to eventually get out and move on. It truly was.
Gotcha. And I guess just having so many kids and having them all be able to, I guess, I'm trying to think of the best way to word it. There's a lot of family dynamic and a lot of things and a lot of responsibility with having so many kids. I guess, what do you feel like you were most responsible for in the child rearing part versus what Cherry's responsible for? Like, did you feel like you were more obligated to teach him about certain things, and she was more obligated to try providing, or just taking care of food, or things like that? Or is that a question we should skip for now?
No, that's a question that I think is appropriate. My sense of responsibility was to provide enough money for us to hold body and soul together, and for us to provide for housing adequately, and for the rest of the necessities of daily life. And we did it successfully enough. Your grandmother also was very active professionally. She ended up running a laboratory operation for the largest woolen mill in the world, which just happened to be just outside of Chattanooga, Peerless Woolen Mills. And she ran the testing labs for them and set them up in such a way that they had never had before, because of her science and laboratory experiences that she had grown up with at the University of Minnesota. And so she was able to contribute to that, and between just one job and another, we managed to survive okay. It was not easy. It was the most difficult time, I think, of all the years that we were raising our family. It was the most difficult time in terms of the economics of raising a family.
But there were good times, of course.
Oh, sure. We got in an old car and drove the Tennessee back mountains and Georgia mountains, and had lots of good family times that way. We did not really do an awful lot of traveling. We couldn't. but we did much more when we got to Dallas. But we did have a good time, many good times with the family around the southern Tennessee and North Georgia areas. Yeah,
Yeah, beautiful,
Yeah.
beautiful country for
It
sure.
truly is. And Lookout Mountain is a very, very beautiful place.
Are there any, I guess, aside from the financial side, are there any values that you really felt that you wanted to pass on to your children in terms of both just cultural values and musical values and things like that?
At that time,
Yes.
no, I didn't. Wasn't even able to think about that. I don't think that really came into the picture as a concern. Not an active concern on my part, certainly.
Okay.
It was just too busy a time of just survival.
So, and that's just entirely from we're talking from Minneapolis to Chattanooga. Did you feel like you had an opportunity to at least put them in an environment for moral values, at least with Dallas, when you had the assistance of the church community and Caro and your mother as well?
When we moved to Dallas?
Yes. Did you?
Oh, yeah, much more so.
Okay.
Much more so. And really, when we came to Dallas, we became much more active very quickly in an active musical and church culture. Certainly, we were involved in that large church that you drive by many times in Dallas on Preston Road, Preston Hollow Presbyterian Church. We were involved there for 6 years before we moved on to other things. But yeah, those were in many respects good years. I was also working as the head of the sound recording operations of a motion picture laboratory. And that motion picture laboratory in Dallas is really where I got an awful lot of the technological kind of a background in the recording industry. I had already been doing work in the recording industry in Minneapolis. In broadcasting, I had been recording the Minneapolis Symphony Orchestra for broadcast purposes, and so I had already had that technical training before. And I was able to pick up on that in Dallas and use it in the film industry as well. Had a good reputation for making some of the best. We specialized in 16 millimeter educational and technical films, corporate films, and in 16 millimeter is a different technology than 35 millimeter, which was the basic at that time, was the basic motion picture theater medium. And I developed a pretty good reputation for making the best sounding soundtracks in 16 millimeter motion picture film. And the reason was not because I was an engineer, because I wasn't. I had enough basic knowledge to know what I was doing and how to do what I was doing. But I used my ears. I had a musical ear, and I could apply that, and it earned me a pretty good reputation in that industry. So that supported me while I worked part-time in a church. It was not full-time work. I did a full-time job. Your grandmother and I together did. We ran a full-time program at Preston Hollow, but the living was earned at Southwest Film Labs.
Understood. You mentioned, obviously, you've mentioned at times that you were once the voice of Bell Helicopter and used to
That's
have
right.
a good ear and all of that. Do you feel like you taught your kids how to listen to music and to actually listen to the sound around them? Or was that something that
To
picked
some
up on their own?
extent, I think I did. I would dare say that, as you know, in Dallas, we lived only a block away from my parents, and your parents' grandparents lived just a block away. And my father, if he had one characteristic as the musician that he was, we've talked about that at other times. If there was one time that, if there was one characteristic that he had, which was really extraordinary, he was a master of knowing how to really listen to music, musical performances. Not only the musical performance itself, but the music that's behind it. And I dare say that those of my children, your parents, your generation's parents, they really learned it more from I think their grandfather than they did even from me. But of course, I inherited a good deal of it, and I was the practitioner of it in my particular arena. So they did know what I was doing, that I was doing it too.
Yeah.
But he was really a master of listening. They could not go into their grandfather's house when he was listening to music without being told to sit down and to listen, and how to listen, and what to listen for, and why. So he was really the master at that.
It sounds like they were, obviously you guys were pretty close, or at least the grandchildren were pretty close with Carl. Do you remember having an emotional reaction to just watching him teach or watch over your kids, and how that felt to you at all? Did you feel happy, relieved, angry at all, or?
No. It was a very gratifying experience from my perspective. We've talked before about some of the difficulties that I had personally growing up with my father, but that did not carry over to my children growing up partially in his house as well as my house. That's a wonderful thing about grandparents and grandchildren. They can get along wonderfully well even when children and their parents can't. That was true in our family as well.
Yeah, gotcha. And so no points of, I hate to beat a dead horse, but no points of resentment for him for the way he treated them versus the way he treated you at all?
On my part?
Yeah.
That's an interesting question. If there was, it didn't last very long, because it was during those early years in Dallas, living a block away, that what I've talked about before, I got to the point of realizing that the most important thing I had to do in terms of my relationships, my early relationships with my father, which were painful, was to forgive my father. And I did. We've dealt with all of that subject before. So that was not an issue. It was not an issue of being jealous at all. It was a very gratifying thing to be on the sidelines and watch the dynamic between my children and their grandchildren, their grandparents.
Understood. And yeah, obviously it's important for children to have as many points of view as possible as well. Do you remember a point where you do you remember any particular points where you saw your children growing up and you said, this is when they're their own person? Like, oh, they finally, like, one example that comes to mind that is one of my favorite stories is when Pete went to go to the bank on his own and tried to apply for a loan. And are there any other moments like that with Martha or David or Paul or anything like that? Or Vicky, of course.
No, I can't remember any. Whether it's just that my mind does not function very quickly to remember some things that I really ought to remember, I don't know. But no, I don't think that I felt that my children had really reached the point of being who they were going to be yet. That came later. That came later after they left home and they got into their own school work on whatever college level that they did, to whatever extent that they did. That's when they were on their own, but not during those years.
Okay.
No, I don't think so.
Gotcha. So they did have their own personalities.
Really?
Yes. Yeah. No. Definitely one thing I want to cover at least would be kind of your perspective on dinners at the Carpathian household, and at least a little bit of recount on some good moments from there.
But you know, I think that if there was one thing that your grandmother and I did right, and it was really your grandmother's doing as far as making it happen is concerned.
Mm-hmm.
I think if there's one thing that we did right was we had our meals together. You know, in this day and age, it seems that parents and children go their own way on having their meals or whatever they want to individually. And we gathered for breakfast every morning. We gathered for lunch on weekends. We gathered for dinner every night, period. It was just the thing that in our family, that's the way we did it. And it was just the rule of the house, it was the rule of the family, and it worked fine. There were both good moments and not so good moments around the table, but mostly there were good moments. They really were crazy moments.
Right.
When you get 5 children, 2 parents, and often 2 grandparents, and who knows how many neighbor kids and school chums that were also there, it got to be quite a party every meal, often.
Absolutely. No, there's one particular story that always sticks out in my head is the one where you invited a guest over to and they wanted to try every single flavor of ice cream or something like that.
That actually happened in a year that we spent here in Austin. During those Dallas years, we went right back to Dallas in less than a year. But yes, we had a friend who came and and we had a big, in addition to our refrigerator freezer, we had a big cubic foot freezer, stand-up freezer. And we did it as an economy measure because we would go to the day-old bread store and we would buy a week or so's bread at a time, and we go whenever half-gallon ice cream was on sale, which it often enough was, and we'd buy 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 half gallons and put it in the freezer. And so we always had a large variety of ice cream in our freezer. And I remember we asked this friend of ours who was visiting us, and we were going to have ice cream for dessert. And we asked her, what flavor would you like? Oh, I'll just have whatever you have. And I says, and then she said, whatever you have, just I'll take a little bit of it. And it just so happened, I think it was 32 or 33 different flavors that we had at the time. So we got a big bowl and put 32 or 33 scoops of ice cream and put it in front of her. And she did a pretty good job on most of it, as I recall. One of our lighter moments.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. I don't know. It's interesting to see how much food is a communal part of this family, and it's something that has been carried on at least through all of our generations. I guess is there anything at least from when maybe you were a kid that you felt you can definitely see has been passed on to your children or your grandchildren at all?
Well, you've mentioned that one item. We always, in my growing up years, we always ate together. Apparently, Cherry's family, it was that way too. And so when we had our family, it was just a natural thing that was the way we were going to do it in our house as well. Mm-hmm. Our family was going to gather around table for dinner, for any meal. And so that's what we did. But that's really started in my growing up years, and apparently also in your grandmother's growing up years. That's just the way we grew up. And so whatever traditions that you all have now in your generation, that's where it started.
Clearly, texting while at the dinner table is one of the important traditions.
Texting was a great interruption. Yeah, right. In those days.
I can. Oh, look, it's talkie. Anyway, I don't know what I'm talking about. I guess, is there anything that you feel like possibly you could have done a better job in passing on yourself? And I know I'm rehashing, but
sure. I can tell you one of the most important ones that I could have passed on that I didn't. My parents, my father, used to yell at my brother and me a lot in our growing up years. And, it's a funny thing. You may determine in your mind that you're not going to be like your father in raising your kids, raising your children. But somehow or other, you can't necessarily easily make that happen. And I know that there was an awful lot of yelling at my kids that I did. And your grandmother and I also did a pretty good job of our arguments got into the yelling mode an awful lot. And I would have, in looking back, I would wish that we hadn't done that. That I could have been successful in what I really inside of me wanted to do, and that is not yell at my children. I just was not successful at it. I'm afraid I yelled much too much at my children. Unfortunately, it was compounded by and made worse by the fact that I had, right now you won't know it because whatever it is, I got this frog in my throat. But I've always had a big voice, which compounds the problem. When you can yell louder than everybody else all put together, it gets pretty formidable. And I just wish that hadn't happened. I wish that could have been different.
Understood. And that isn't definitely an understandable thing. I don't know. From a grandchild's perspective, it seems that it's something that didn't get passed on, luckily. So you didn't do that bad a job, at least from my perspective. But
good.
Yeah.
I'm glad. I'm glad if it means that my children succeeded in not carrying that on as a tradition. That's great. I'm glad.
Agreed. And do you think, and this is somewhat of a non-question, do you feel like any of the children, or any of your children, were more of a product of where they had initially grown up than others? Like, say, because we moved to Lookout Mountain, one child was a lot more different than the others, or moving to Dallas was an important part for them to grow up and to be who they are. Yeah. Does anything like that come to mind, or is that too broad a question?
I don't know that it's too broad a question. I'm not sure that I know how to answer it. We're all a product, I think, and I think this includes my children, your generation's parents. I think are all products partially of where they grew up. I'm sure that the difficult years, that the 4 years in Lookout Mountain were, had their impact on them. That was not necessarily positive.
Mm-hmm.
To look back and be able to philosophize on what the unfortunate aspects of those years might have been in terms of direct impact on any one of them, I would be hard pressed. I do know that your father probably um, had a turn of mind and heart, possibly about me during those years. I would protest that it certainly would be understandable because those were also he was the oldest, and he was the much closer to maturing rapidly enough as a young guy. How old was he? Maybe 9 at that time. I can't remember, 8 or 9. And those are critical years, and I think those were probably pretty tough on your father, Pete, than more than anybody else. So yes, those Lookout Mountain years did have an impact. The difficulty that they were for me and for your mother too, because we just couldn't escape the difficulty there was in the relation for the two of us as well. It all, one thing infects the other. I'm sure it had an impact certainly on your father. But, you know, we all end up, all of us, I'm sure your generation as well, we all end up in our growing up years having some things happen in our lives or to us that ultimately we have to deal with ourselves as we grow up. I can recognize the things that I may have been responsible for in your father's difficult years that he had as a result of some of the things that I may have burdened him with. But unfortunately, which is true with me as well as my brother, also my 5 children, each of them had to deal with, okay, what do we do about it on their own? You have to do the same thing. Everybody in the 12 of you in your generation have to do the same thing.
Agreed.
And that is an interesting thing to watch from the perspective of my role as now the patriarch of my branch of the family.
Is there anything, I guess, that you picked up as a result of your children teaching yourself that changed your life? Like, I guess I hate to keep picking on Pete here, but he did keep pushing you to quit smoking at one point, like that.
Those are the Chattanooga years.
Yes. Are there any other moments that you can think of off the top of your head, or is that something to consider?
Well, he's not here right in the moment, so I can just plain tell you that he was a pain in the butt. To put it more than just a little mildly, he made himself as difficult as he possibly could. Because it was the time when, just stop and think of it, it was the time when the Surgeon General of the United States was making the first statements about the perils, the health perils that smoking does. And it was being broadcast widely and thoroughly enough that your father picked up on it big time as something to be thought seriously about. And being the serious-minded young man that he was, he took it seriously, and he was very much concerned that his father was going to be killing himself. And by smoking, and I was a 3.5 pack a day man then those years, and I had already tried to quit smoking a number of times. We all do, I think, as smokers. But I was fortunate to take him seriously, and it really was because I took him seriously. And I realized that the best thing I could do to show him that he's right in being serious about it, that I needed to quit smoking, and really quit smoking. And so I came up with what was a solution for me. I can't remember whether I've ever mentioned this in some of our sessions, but I don't think I have. And that was that on a Labor Day in 1962, Labor Day weekend, I realized, okay, I am going to quit smoking, but I'm not just going to quit smoking. I've done that enough, and unsuccessfully. I'm going to smoke the last cigarette for the rest of my life on New Year's Eve, and that was Labor Day weekend. So I smoked all those months and weeks until New Year's Eve 1962, knowing that on New Year's Eve I was going to be smoking the last cigarette for the rest of my life. And that worked. We happened to have a big party. We were part of a party at somebody else's home, as a matter of fact, that New Year's Eve, until we didn't get home until about 4:30. I
Wow.
think the count was about almost 5 packs a day that day, because the day went so long. I know it was over 4.5, and so I quit smoking on New Year's Eve 1962. Haven't been a smoker since. I have picked up a couple of maybe half a dozen times or so back in the late 80s, early 90s. I thought, I'm a big boy. I can certainly handle this, and I accepted a cigarette a few times, but I realized very quickly, this is dangerous. So I quit. I stopped that real quick. So essentially, I have not been a smoker since New Year's Eve 1962, thanks to your pop.
So we can all agree he's the biggest pain in the ass, is what you're saying.
No question.
Okay.
Absolutely, we can agree with that. But that was a good one.
Yeah.
That was a good call.
Absolutely.
I know damn well that I wouldn't be here sitting talking to you if I had continued to smoke. I would have been long gone, long time ago. I was just too heavy a smoker.
That's a pretty significant amount, just from everything that I'm hearing. So.
Yep.
Do you remember any other particularly difficult times with your kids, or just pain in the ass moments?
Pain in the ass moments. Well, yeah, I can remember a few. One of the things that was often a difficulty, we've already talked about tonight. We've already talked about the fact that we ate our meals all together. Well, in the Dallas years, the consequence of that was that between your grandmother and certainly at least 3, if not 4, of the 5 children in the house, I didn't ever have much of a chance to say anything. There were many times that I really wanted to express myself and say a few things about something that I thought was important, that should be important to us all. Impossible. There was no way to get beyond the noise of the rabble that was going on around the table, because especially the 3 guys in the family, once they were on a roll, forget it for anybody else, and they were always on a roll. And to answer the question,
It illustrates a little bit
Does it draw
more,
you a picture?
Yeah. Maybe one of those better coming to you live kind of moments, but yeah.
Yeah, those are times that I'm sad that they were that way, but the past is past.
Understood. And I want to make sure that we cover a couple of Martha's questions, and because I've just been rambling on and on here.
Go.
What do you remember about the births of each of your children?
Well, I was present for the birth of the first 4 at the University Hospital at the University of Minnesota. It was permissible for the father to be present in the birthing room, and so I was. There was a glass window. There was a viewing room, literally, within 8 feet or so of the delivery table where your grandmother was, and so I was able to be present for the birth of your father, for the birth of Vicky and for Paul and for David.
Mhm.
In Chattanooga, backwards place, as certainly at that time that Chattanooga seemed to be, no way would the father be allowed anywhere close to the birthing room. And so I had to wait until it was all over before I knew that I had one more daughter in the family. So, but I remember being present for their birth, and I remember the really, as difficult as a couple of the births were for your grandmother, it was really each one of them was a very, very joyful time. Each one of them was. And even when Martha was born, it was a very, very joyful time. I just wasn't present for the actual birth, that moment, in her case.
Well, I think I know the answer, but a follow-up question is, was news of a new pregnancy always good news?
No. We were told in no uncertain terms after David was born that Cherry better not have any more children. And so it was purely from the medical point of view, it was a frightening moment for your grandmother more than for me, because being the father, we fathers sometimes tend to be ignorant about the real realities of carrying and birthing a child. But it was a moment of considerable fright for your grandmother, just in terms of the medical aspect of carrying a child another time, a fifth time. And fortunately, there was no difficulty at all, and there was no difficulty even at the time of birth, and certainly afterwards. And so it proved to be a non-problem time, for which we're all thankful. But there was that moment of medical fright on the part of your grandmother, particularly at that time. But no, we even when Peter surprised us by being conceived, and when we realized it, that it had to have happened on our honeymoon, it was a joyful thing. It really was.
Understood. One thing I just kind of want to know is, what were the favorite ages of your children, at least as far as
Favorite ages?
Yes, as far as parenting goes.
That's easy. No. It really is, because we're all adults. Until this year, I have had, for the last bit of time, I've had 5 50-somethings. Now I've got one that goes even beyond that, and to be able to have weathered some of the early years, weathered some of the difficult times, weathered some of the economics of my family's growing up, having gone through all of that and come to this point in my life and their lives, I just marvel at it. I just think it's wonderful. I think it's really the happiest time in my life in terms of relationship with my children. No question about it. That doesn't mean there weren't great times in earlier years, which may be what you're really asking about. But to answer your question totally correctly,
Yeah.
no.
That's fair. It definitely answers my next question of at what age were we as individuals when you felt you could relate to us best, which is now. Sounds like.
Well, no.
Oh.
I've been able to relate with all of your parents, your generation's parents, for quite a long time now. But to be able to do it as well as it's happening right now, I don't think there's any question that now is the time that it certainly is best. No question.
Do you think it's a time, or what do you think was the catalyst for just all of it just really coming together, other than just time and waiting for everybody to just kind of grow up and be on the same page?
No, I think there's more to it. It's not just a simple matter at all. I think that one of the things that not to brag, but I think that one of the things that has been important to me is never stop growing, never stop learning, never stop becoming something better than you are. That's always been part of who I am. Even in the tough years, that was true. But and the best thing about that is that I think also all 5 of my children are doing the same thing. Each one of them has gone through their own, up to the time that they are now. I think they've gone through with great intentionality. Each one of them individually has gone through the process and continues to go through the process of becoming who they can become. They haven't just plain considered themselves, okay, we've grown up now, I've gotten where I'm going to be, this is who I am, period. That's the end of the line. And then from now on, all I do is just live. It's never been that way with, I think, anybody in our family. We've all been growing all along the line, all the time. I think that's the best part of the whole deal.
Okay. Good answer. Make sure one more time here. Yeah. So there. One of her last questions. Let's see. Kind of switching context here. Holidays seem to bring up conflicting emotions for you, Mom. What was your favorite holiday with the family?
That's a hard question. It really is a hard question. It would be easy, just off the top of my head, to say Christmas. But it rarely was really the best of times in any given year, because somehow or other, and I don't know how to say this easily, I think that the reality is your grandmother had a, still to me, unknown sense of expectation of what could be in the family during the Christmas season. And all I know is that we never made it, or certainly I never made it, as far as meeting Cherry's expectation is concerned. I think it's fair for me to say that. I think I'm accurate in saying that. Certainly from my perspective, I am. But nevertheless, even in spite of that being a factor, Christmas has always been, for me, with the family, growing up years, just that best of times. The best of those years was probably in the years in Dallas, when the grandparents, your great-grandparents, were always together with us. Either we were in their house, in fact we usually went to their house and then to our house, or vice versa, and we were all together. Things was never the big deal. I think I can honestly say lots of gifts and things were not the measure at all, but just the fun that we had being together and sharing with whatever we were giving each other. It was never an easy time, and it was never an easy time for a very simple reason. Doing what I do for a living and as a profession, and also as a personal commitment. Christmas Eve is always a time of being committed to something else other than my family. And then to focus on that so much, as I always do still, and then have Christmas morning arrive, I'm the last person to be prepared for the family. And I think that a lot of that had to do with your grandmother's at least giving me the sense that I never met her expectations, because I was never really ever well prepared for Christmas morning, Christmas Day. I never felt that I was, but it was still the best holiday of the year. And right close to it was Thanksgiving, when we would all get together for a big family meal. The family far and wide, and usually with some extra family, non-family guests. We often had non-family guests in our household. And Thanksgiving was one of the great times for that.
Yeah.
So I'll call that a real close one too.
Understand. Just kind of having one of these odd thoughts. Is there anybody, I guess, you would classify not as one of your true children that you would classify as family, or kids that you helped raise?
Say that again.
Like, were there anybody in the choir that you felt you helped raise as kids themselves, or anything like that? Or did you feel... The answer can be no, it's just...
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so. I know I've always been encouraging to choir people, especially those who have been students or are in their own process of growing up. We have students, of course, in our choir now. And I encourage them as much as I know how to encourage them, given the time constraints that are also involved. But no, I don't think that I ever felt that I was involved with raising them. No.
Perfectly good answer.
No.
Okay. Well, I'll be honest, I'm kind of out of questions to ask.
We've done this session, in other words.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's been a good one, Jeff.
Yeah.
I've enjoyed it. It's been a good one.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.